Jannie Rossouw and Gerhard Joubert have teamed up to put together South Africa's first comprehensive inflation survey. Now, Jannie was in the studio not long ago talking about South Africa's fiscal cliff, a fascinating concept, the danger of government spending running ahead of government revenue. Well, now we're talking about inflation and perceptions of it, and they join us now for more insight. Jannie, let's start with you. We're talking about inflation, but it's perceptions of inflation, and you've done quite a rigorous research project about what people think of inflation, not what it is, but how they see it.
Good morning, David. Good morning, Gerhard. Good morning to your viewers. Yes, indeed, it's the first time in South Africa that we've asked a group of respondents to give us their perception of historic inflation and the expectations of future inflation. Up to now, this has been done with different groups of respondents. We can now prove for the first time that people's perceptions of past inflation, those perceptions feed into the expectations of future inflation. So from a policy perspective, it's very important to keep inflation perceptions under control.
So just put it down to a sort of everyday level. You're asking me what I thought happened with inflation in the past.
Indeed. And then I ask you, what do you think will happen with inflation in the future?
All right, so was that the question? Because we've got a graph of the response to your first question, which was?
First question was, what do you think the rate of inflation was over the past 12 months?
Well, there's the graph on the board. How much did prices increase during the past 12 months? And just to explain what it's telling us?
It says that 61.5% of respondents they are of the view that inflation increased more rapidly than the official rate of inflation, and 14.2% said that inflation increased much more rapidly than the official rate of inflation. You add those two together, it means that nearly 75% of South Africans think South Africans in our sample think that inflation increased much more rapidly, and those perceptions of what they think, those perceptions feed through in what they expect inflation to do in the future.
All right, let's pause there now. The PPS, Gerhard, that's where you are. You've been helping with us.
We have been, David. We've been doing the Professional Confidence Index, which really asks our members, who are all graduate professionals with a minimum of a four-year degree. We ask them a range of questions about perceptions about socioeconomic issues like crime, healthcare, education, and that. And we added inflation to the mix for this particular survey, where we had 3,500 people, all graduate professionals, as I said, participating in the survey, and that was in respect of Q3 of 2014.
That's regarded as a legitimate survey, that number.
I mean, on average, we've got about between 3,000 and 6,000 people. I mean, it's the only survey really that reflects the views of the graduate professional. And these are an important group of people in our country to get their
All right,
views.
now explain to me why this is important, Jannie. So these are graduate professionals. The minimum you need is a postgraduate four-year degree. So that's a certain universe of people. You've got quite a lot of them surveyed. Why is that important in what's going to happen in the future?
It's important because they are powerful decision makers and they are powerful consumers, and people act in consumption decisions based on their expectations. So when people expect inflation to be much higher in future than what it is at the moment, they spend in such a way. In other words, they bring closer the purchasing decisions.
So it's the old thing of saying in 3 years' time or 2 years' time, buying whatever it is you want is going to be much more expensive, so I better do it now.
Indeed. But the important question then is, how can the authorities contain inflation expectations and contain perceptions?
Well, let's pause on that and look at your second question. Is it the time now to look at that?
Indeed.
So your second question that you put to the members of the PPS was what?
The second question was, what do we expect inflation to be? And if you look here, in this case, more than 70% of respondents expect inflation to be higher than the current rate of inflation. And this brings me to the conclusion that it's time for South Africa to rethink its inflation range, its target range. In my view, 3 to 6% is too high. We should have a policy of bringing that gradually lower over time, perhaps to something like 1 to 3% or 1 to 4%.
So now the policymakers, you used to work at the Reserve Bank.
Indeed.
This kind of statistic will go to the Reserve Bank now. It'll be available to them if they want it. What are they going to do with this? What should they do with it?
They should consider this new finding in their monetary policy committee deliberations, because it shows clearly the link between inflation perceptions and inflation expectations. And the aim, the target, the goal of the Reserve Bank is to contain inflation and inflation expectations.
There is actually a monetary policy committee meeting tonight, so it might be interesting for that to be raised there.
Interesting to know if it's on the agenda by now, because you came out last week with this information.
Indeed.
Yeah. I'm interested also, Gerhard, what other kinds of information that you get from your members which could be of use to Reserve Bank or other policymakers? Because as Jannie says, it's a ready-made, defined audience which is accessible to be researched.
David, we asked them a few questions about, I mean, their confidence level, their overall confidence level is actually the lowest that it's ever been since 2011. So they are concerned about a range of issues, ranging from unemployment to healthcare, to crime, to all kinds of other things. We also asked them a particular question. The highest concern is actually about the lack of the number of mathematics and science graduates coming through the tertiary education system, which is the biggest concern, because that's the feeder market for those professions.
But now, crime, health, you'd think this market is more cushioned against increases in health spending, expenditure, also more cushioned against crime in terms of being able to afford security?
The biggest concern is actually unemployment, because they know what the impact of unemployment levels rising over the next 5 years, what it will be on the country. So they're quite confident about their own professions. There's about a 76% confidence level in the future of their own profession about the next in the next 5 years. But when you ask them about macro issues and socioeconomic issues outside their profession, they raise a range of concerns.
Jannie, it's interesting to have a group like this postgrad, a 4-year degree, as you say. On the one hand, these are intelligent people, by definition educated. They often are very focused on their own field of expertise. They're busy people, perhaps don't take that much account of the broader economic area. Why is it that they get it wrong? Why do they think that inflation is more than it is?
You cannot really say right or wrong, David, because I ask you a perception.
But why is their perception that?
So it seems to me that the basket of goods and services that they buy, the prices of those goods and services increase more rapidly than general prices for a general cross-section of the public. But going forward, we have a dual approach now. PPS has kindly agreed that we can continue with this going forward every quarter, and this will now be underpinned by similar research of a broad cross-section, a representative sample of the South African population, to compare the PPS results amongst professionals with a cross-section of the South African population.
It depends where you are in the economic spectrum, doesn't it? I mean, you think of a domestic servant who may get, say, 2,000 Rand a month, and 1,000 of that is spent on transport. So 50% of the wage is spent on transport every month. Their perception of inflation will be governed almost entirely by food and transport, wouldn't it?
Exactly.
How are you going to get that research done?
Well, the idea is to go for a representative sample of all South Africans, from the poorest to the most wealthy. Male, female, a good balance of that, also an age spread. Now that is not the PPS survey. The PPS survey is a very useful survey amongst high income individuals. But to underpin this with the broader survey will give us a broader picture to see how these two fit together, and based on that find the way forward.
Your point about the inflation ban being too generous, do you see politically, in practical terms, anything changing there?
My concern is that inflation expectations are now sort of centered around 6%. People had forgotten that it's actually 3 to 6%, because inflation has been close to 6%, and if I say inflation, I mean the official rate. And therefore, a movement from the authorities in pushing the ban down will give an important symbol to the public. But yes, it will be politically loaded, because I can bring you as many economists that will argue for a higher
Of
band.
course they will. There's plenty of them. Gerhard, the other thing, you know, there's a business confidence index. Do you do an overall confidence survey with your defined group?
we
and what's
do.
that telling us?
As I said, David, I mean, we do the professional confidence index, which was actually at the lowest rate now that it's been since 2011. We do it on a quarterly basis. That's gone down by gone down to 51%. So that's quite low. I mean, it's
How long have you been doing it?
We've been doing it since 2011, so we do it on a quarterly basis. You know, we asked them about the economic outlook for South Africa, and they're not particularly confident at the moment. So.
Well, good research, interesting conclusions from it. That was Jannie Rossouw. He's the head of the Wits School of Economics and Business Sciences, and Gerhard Joubert from the Professional Providence Society, or the PPS.